I'm Victoria Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth. And today I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Rabbi Marshall Meyer Great Issues Lecture on Social Justice. The topic in particular is interesting: Confederation, the realistic two-state solution. But first, I'm happy to say this event is co-sponsored by a number of Dartmouth entities, not only the Dickey Center, but also the Tucker Center for Spiritual and Ethical Life, the Jewish Studies Program, in collaboration with Middle Eastern Studies, and it's all made possible by a gift from Marina and Andrew Lewin, class of '81. And I'm pleased to say I think they're online with us today. The idea about this, and thanks to their generosity, is to have a Great Issues lecture every year that focuses on social justice in the Jewish tradition that Rabbi Marshall Meyer personified, and to feature speakers who are truly helping to heal the world and expressing the values that Rabbi Meyer saw as the very core of Judaism. This event is also part of the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Dickey Center, where we have for many years thought about great issues, but not only talk about them, but to bring people together who are trying to address them. And I'm pleased that today's panel will try to do exactly that. So, as we all know, increasingly, in any discussions of ways to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one hears that the two-state solution is no longer seen as a plausible way to resolve it and to move forward. Tonight, we'll ask a different question. What if the problem has always been the simplified way that two states have been envisioned? What if could a confederal approach yet redeem that two-state solution? We are pleased to host this rare event, a discussion of confederation among three leading experts, facilitated and supported by two expert professors. So let me go to my introductions. First, we have Yossi Beilin, who is the former Israeli deputy foreign minister and the architect of the Oslo Accords. He's an Israeli politician who has served in multiple ministerial and leadership positions in the Israeli government, including Minister of Economics and Planning, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, Minister of Justice, and Minister of Religious Affairs. A significant figure in the 1990s Israeli-Palestinian peace process, he also served as deputy foreign minister in the negotiations that led, as I just mentioned, to the Oslo Accords. Welcome. Next, we have Omar Dajani, who is on the Palestine Liberation Organization's negotiation support team. He is recognized as a leading expert on legal aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He's also a professor of law and co-director of the McGeorge Global Center for Business and Development at the University of the Pacific. Formerly, he was a member of the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, where he worked on peace-building initiatives and played a leading role in marshaling and organizing international efforts to support Palestinian legal and political reforms. Our third panelist is Lara Friedman, who is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She's also a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Middle East Project, and with more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena, she earlier served as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, including in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. Lara is a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with expertise on Israel and Palestine. So, if that was not enough, we are also joined by two professors here whose idea this was to bring this community together and these speakers to our campus. First, we'll have Professor Bernard Avashar, who is a visiting professor since 2011 here at Dartmouth. A Guggenheim Fellow, he's also the author of, among other books, The Tragedy of Zionism and the Hebrew Republic. He contributes regularly on political economy and Israeli affairs to The New Yorker, writes articles for Harper's, The New York Review, The Nation, and The New York Times Magazine. He's a former editor of Harvard Business Review and the international director of intellectual capital at KPMG. The professor will serve the role of respondent after the panelists make their remarks. And then, of course, we have our moderator. Professor Ezzedine Fisher teaches at Dartmouth's Middle East Studies. He's been with us since 2016 here at Dartmouth. His pre-Dartmouth career included a decade of active involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict, where he worked as an advisor to the UN envoy to the Middle East peace process, counselor to the Egyptian foreign minister, and a project director at Crisis Group. The floor is yours, Ezzedine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tori, and thanks to the Dickey Center. I think this event is a testimony to the Dickey's mission of bringing the world to Dartmouth, and thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. Without further ado, I'll just explain how we're going to do this. I'm going to ask the participants in 2 rounds, 1 question each, and hopefully we'll keep the answers to about 4 minutes. And then we'll open for a discussion for the audience, both here and online, right? So I'll start with Yossi. And as Tori has said, there is a growing skepticism about the 2-state solution. Many think it's dead, and others think that it's even worse, that the 2-state solution serves as a device to prevent the Palestinians from claiming their equal rights. Now, this formula of confederation, how does it address, how is it any different from the 2-state solution idea that, as we have seen, didn't actually work?
Thank you very much. Well, the idea of the 2-state solution is very much criticized. But regretfully, there is no other alternative which is accepted by most of the people in on the 2 sides, Israel and the Palestinians, and by the world. So the 2-state solution, which was not mentioned 30 years ago or 40 years ago as the option, because there were other options there, at least theoretically, of a Palestinian Jordanian confederation or Jordanian-Palestinian state, or just Jordan getting back the territory of the West Bank. All these options actually disappeared. And the 2-state solution became the consensus of the world about the way to solve the problem. The Confederation is actually giving the option that although we are speaking about very clear 2-state solutions with a border between them, there will be much higher level of cooperation than just between 2 states, 2 neighboring states. Taking into account the very small area west to the Jordan River and the need to have joint planning and zoning and deal with diseases of animals, of human beings, and dealing with issue of natural resources, of water, and many other issues, including security. So the Confederation is a part of the 2-state solution with an umbrella which will enable the 2 states to cooperate with each other in a more intimate way. It also solves, or at least the paper that Omar and myself were involved with, is solving 2 or is answering 2 very important issues. On the one hand, there is the issue of the evacuation of the settlers who will find themselves as a result of the agreement to the east of the new border. There is, of course, the big debate whether all the settlements are illegal or legal or whatever, but they are there, and you're speaking about hundreds of thousands of people. And this is a big impediment for any Israeli leader, right or left, to evacuate them. So the idea is that those settlers who would like to remain outside of the new borders of Israel will be allowed to remain Israeli citizens, but will become permanent Palestinian residents, and the same number of Palestinian citizens will be allowed to Israel as permanent residents. So this is one thing which we believe is actually solving a very big impediment of the 2-state solution. And on the other hand, there was criticism about the fact that in our previous attempts in the Geneva Initiative and others, we refer to the 67 problems, but not to the 48 problems. The root causes of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And many used to say there is no chance in the world that we can agree upon history. We may agree about the future, but not about the past. And suggested to us not to touch it, because it is fire. And we said, no, we will try to do that. And we worked on this paper more than 2 years, and we prepared for the first time, I think in history, a joint narrative built on the events themselves and the different interpretations of the same events by the two sides. And if you look at our paper, you see that we dedicated 20 pages to the joint narrative, which means that we did deal with the root causes of the conflict, and we are suggesting something which I believe is interesting. So these are the two main issues that we have dealt with. But if you read it, you see that we refer to all the outstanding issues in the conflict, which are mentioned already in the Oslo Original Agreement. And we are suggesting solutions. We believe that it will be easier for the parties to accept an idea of a confederation rather than just the two-state solution, although it keeps the two-state solution in place.
Thank you very much. You mentioned two solutions or 2 points that this formula addresses, and I want to ask Omar about a third major challenge to any solution, and that's the question of security. You experienced firsthand negotiations with the Israeli side about security arrangements that would be satisfactory to both, and unsuccessfully, if I may add, right? How would this new formula address better the challenges that we could not face with the old formula?
Thanks very much for the question, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'll start by saying one of the challenges that the confederal approach presents is complexity. And one of our friends, Khaled al-Gindi, who's an analyst in Washington, described it as the Elizabeth Warren of Palestine-Israeli peace plans. And there is an element of truth to that. It requires one to engage a lot of different factors. But I think that sometimes complexity is critical when you've got two sides that have a set of concerns that can seem to be set against each other. By engaging a complex, by defining a complex solution, you can find means of addressing those issues in ways that serve both people. So, with respect to security, I think a first point, it's not entirely responsive to your concern, but a first point is to bear in mind that what we aim to do here is to remove 3 of the most difficult issues from the agenda of those who might challenge an agreement of this kind in the future: Jerusalem, refugees, and settlements. 3 issues that would make it incredibly difficult for the kind of separation-based paradigm that was being advanced in the 90s and in the early 2000s to work. Why? Because Jerusalem is not a city that's easy to simply divide in down the middle and have operate as 2 different municipalities, whether from a security perspective, an economic perspective, or in terms of the city's cultural and religious legacy, which is well known to all of us. It was very difficult for us to deal with the issue of settlements, bearing in mind that we're now talking about some 600,000 to 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The challenge of relocating those settlers was always one of the impediments to the feasibility of the security framework that we were trying to negotiate previously. Confederation removes that problem. And it also offers a frame through which Palestinian refugees can make their lives in a place that they consider home, a place like Jaffa, where my family comes from, or Haifa, or where have you, through this broader framework. So part of the answer to security is providing solutions to some of the issues that are likely to be an impediment to security in this space. But I think that the confederal frame also provides a means of dealing with some of the strategic security issues that we struggled with previously. So take, for example, how we deal with external threats. With respect to internal threats, there was an understanding that there would be, and in our frame as well, that there would be both Palestinian and Israeli internal security services. But in dealing with external threats, there has always been a profound question, a difficult thing to grapple with. Israel is one of the most, has one of the most powerful militaries in the world. The capacity of a Palestinian military to respond to it or to respond to threats from elsewhere was always going to be limited, even if it were not limited by the agreement itself. What confederal institutions provide for is the ability to think about common security in a different way, to move beyond the deeply asymmetrical and problematic frame of security cooperation that existed in Oslo to something that is premised on equality of right, if not always equality of action. And I'm happy to elaborate on that in our subsequent conversation. But I think if you look at the chapter on security that is in the Holy Land Confederation book, what you see is an effort to articulate both a set of arrangements and a set of principles that depart in meaningful ways from what we have seen implemented in the past. The very last point that I would make on this front is that Confederation also, of course, presents challenges that we don't see elsewhere. Having hundreds of thousands of Palestinian permanent residents in Israel, hundreds of thousands of Israeli permanent residents in the state of Palestine, those present security challenges, certainly, par excellence. And those security challenges will require some robust answers. And I think there's room for strong joint institutions, and the European Union goes some distance toward defining a path for us. And those who say, oh, this, Israel-Palestine is not Europe, should bear in mind, on the other side, that Europe is 100 times larger than Israel-Palestine. If they can do it in that space, surely we can find a capacity to deal with it in our own. But I think that as daunting as the security challenges can be in dealing with internal security in a situation where we move beyond separation, which, let's be honest, was always an illusion. We've got a large Palestinian minority inside of Israel, and we have a large Israeli Jewish population in the West Bank that was always hesitant to leave. But while those are hard things to grapple with, make no mistake, there is no plan, zero, not one, that doesn't face security challenges. And so the question is, how do you find a plan that addresses our respective hopes and aspirations and that presents manageable security challenges rather than one that presents none at all?
All right, I'll come back to you on this because just the idea that settlers would entrust their own security to the Palestinian security apparatus seems a little bit more than just a challenge. But before I do that, I'll go to Professor Bernard Avishai, and Bernie and I co-teach. So you have 5 minutes. You have written extensively on this, and as you said in the introduction where we were discussing, you feel kind of it's very personal. So you also said that there is a political economy aspect and angle on the question that you would elucidate. So could you please do that?
Yeah, I just want to, is this on? I just want to focus on the economic issues, which tend to be marginalized, because I think, as we've heard, we think of Confederation as solving a series of problems, dealing with a series of obstacles. And I think that Confederation also has certain fundamental opportunities attaching to it that I wanted to discuss. I don't want them to get somehow pushed aside, because I think there are advantages to the confederal idea that we don't tend to look at enough. Yossi mentions the issue of scale. I think it's important for us to recognize that the entire area of Israel-Palestine together north of Beersheba, which is largely desert, that entire area is about the size of LA, Los Angeles. The distance between Herzliya, which is the high-tech center of Israel, and Nablus, which is where the Palestinian stock exchange, such as it is about the distance of Hanover to New London. Okay, so we're talking about a really small place. And it's a small place where shared infrastructure and a shared business ecosystem is inescapable. If there were no confederation ever anywhere in the world, it would have had to have been invented for this one case. There are two peoples, two distinct national identities, religiously inflected. You cannot simply take these two peoples and push them together into a single state. There's no argument against the two-state solution that doesn't make the one-state solution ridiculous. But once you assume that there are these two states, you have to think about the opportunities that grow out of a shared urban infrastructure and shared business ecosystem. And let me make a few comments along those lines. You know, we often see these terrible videos of settlers interrupting the harvesting of olives in the West Bank and so on. And we don't pay attention to the fact that agriculture is actually less than 4% of the Palestinian economy, and in the future is not going to have a very important role in developing a Palestinian state if we can get one off the ground. Palestine actually has something like $13 billion in bank deposits in various banks in the West Bank. Of those bank deposits, less than half of it is loaned out, because banks have fiduciary responsibilities and they're not going to lend money to people who don't present proper business plans. The reason why you don't have proper business plans is because Palestine desperately needs intellectual capital, and that means working in an integrated way with the Israeli economy. There's a lot of know-how in the Israeli economy that Palestine is going to need in order to create the entrepreneurial ventures that will allow its financial capital to work. It needs Israeli intellectual capital. One last point, however. Intellectual capital is know-how, it's also know-about. And about 1 million Palestinians have cycled through the Gulf states over the last 40 years, 50 years. It's going to be extremely important for Israeli companies that want to take advantage of opportunities in the Gulf to partner with Palestinian partners who know the Gulf better than any other group of people in the Middle East, who basically built the economies of the Gulf. And it's an opening for both sides to begin to think through what happens the morning after. What happens the morning after the morning after? How do you get to viable states? The states often are spoken of as viable because of territorial contiguity, as if agriculture is really the issue. It's not. You need to have cities that are integrated, that are webs and hubs for each other's economic life. And And without having a confederal system, that is simply not going to be possible.
Thank you very much. Lara Friedman, you have spent most of your entire career in Washington working on these issues. So this is why I'm keeping you close. You're my reality check here. So from a US government, from a US political landscape perspective, how realistic any of this is?
Well, thank you, and thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm something of an odd duck on this panel. I'm not an academic. I haven't served at high levels of government. I'm someone who is very much of a practitioner. And in my current life, and I'll talk about the U.S. government side, but I also do want to talk about a different Palestinian side. In my current life, I spend most of my time trying to give a platform to and amplify voices from the ground, and mainly Palestinian voices who I would say have been excessively not platformed and not centered in these discussions for years. And I will say that, realistic or not realistic, the bottom line for me is this conversation feels it's important, it's intellectually fascinating. I'm reminded of, I think it was back in the early aughts when the Rand Corporation produced an amazing study called The Arc. For those of us who are old enough to remember, where they had maps and a whole plan for how to revitalize the West Bank by building, railroads and all this infrastructure, and it was hailed, and when people brought it to Capitol Hill, and I looked at it and I said, this is the equivalent of SimCity or Second Life does Israel-Palestine. I mean, it's amazing. If you actually ignore everything that's happening on the ground, if you ignore all the political constraints, if you ignore all of the grievances legitimate grievances that have accumulated in the life of a process which has not brought peace to anyone, this is what you can do. I have people email me probably once a week with their peace plan. They have the plan that's going to make peace. They have the formula for a conference that will be the breakthrough. I think this is intellectually fun. I think to the extent that it is disconnected from what's happening on the ground, and it's not just today, we're talking 20-some years, Israelis have concluded, when we hold out the economic promise for Israelis, I think my Israeli friends will say, you say that to younger Israelis, they say, we have nothing to gain by making any compromise of any kind. And pragmatically, I'd say they're not wrong based on experience. And if you talk to Palestinians, not Palestinian diplomats, but even the Palestinian intellectuals who are now writing and speaking based in Ramallah or based in Geneva or wherever, their answer is, we have literally nothing to lose to walk away from this entire peace process framework. One state, two state, confederation, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. What we care about now is rights. And we're going to put that in the same framework as every other people in the world, particularly indigenous people who are fighting for their rights against a privileged power. And we're going to put it in the settler colonial framework, in the rights framework. And I have to say, this conversation has no resonance. And that doesn't mean it's not worth exploring intellectually. I don't want to poo-poo this, and I encourage everyone to read the Confederation report. The level of detail and goodwill and creativity and intellectual vigor that went into it is incredibly impressive and quite inspiring. But I have to say, I have seen multiple events exploring Confederation. I haven't seen any events exploring the fact that last week Israel imposed new restrictions on access to the West Bank. I don't see how you're going to bring intellectual capital to the West Bank when Israel has just now shut it almost completely to Palestinian visitors, or to professors. You have to get approval to come, or to family members if you're not a first-degree family member. How do you get intellectual capital in there? How do you move forward by convincing Palestinians that there's a prospect for confederation when the current and most recent progressive or moderate government that included the left has pursued people find the term uncomfortable. They're pursuing ethnic cleansing in the South Hebron Hills. Hundreds of Palestinians who've lived there for generations on what is now a firing range, which we have historical documents that came out of archives saying it was declared a firing range in order to erase the Palestinians from this area. And the moderate government is going ahead with that. This conversation has no traction and no credibility if people are not also talking about Palestinian rights, because it is not a level playing field. It is not a status quo where, well, Oslo has failed and lost credibility because people became disillusioned, and now we have to give them hope. They didn't just get disillusioned. Israelis became triumphant in their approach. We don't need to do anything to make peace. And Palestinians learned, often at the end of the Israeli IDF weapons, that they have nothing to gain by staying locked in this construction. And the last thing you asked about Washington, in terms of reality, in this administration, which is, I think, coming on the heels of the Trump administration, was seen as the more pragmatic, more engaged. They have demonstrated that there is little to no willingness to invest political capital to press Israel to do anything it doesn't want to do. So if people can come up with a peace plan in which Israel, which will be credible with Palestinians, and in which Israel doesn't have to do anything it doesn't want to do, I would say it has a chance of being adopted and supported by the US government. But that peace plan, it's not just a unicorn. I mean, the unicorn you can at least draw. I don't know what that animal would look like. So, I think it's difficult.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go back to Yossi. And as we have heard, I think it's safe to say that the Confederation offers solutions to many of the problems that hampered the two-state solution. You mentioned the question of settlements, refugees, the joint narrative, and so on. But it doesn't seem to offer a solution to the political problems that made progress towards a peaceful settlement of the conflict possible. It doesn't address the weakness of the leaders on both sides, or leaderships. It doesn't address the strength of a right wing in Israel that is simply not interested, or Hamas and other rejectionists on the Palestinian side. So what do you say to this? How would you reconcile this kind of structural solution that seems more attractive, more feasible, with a political reality that seems to be slipping further away from what we need to have in order to move towards that solution?
Well, actually, you are telling us that a solution is difficult to achieve. And here we are having a very broad common denominator. But the question is, what if? I mean, okay, it's difficult, seems almost impossible. Is it really impossible? And if you think that it is impossible, are you giving up on a solution? We are the ones who cannot give up. We cannot afford it. The world may give up. Kashmir. When are we going to solve the issue of Kashmir? We don't have solutions. We don't have agreements. We don't have draft agreements. The world lives with a conflict in Kashmir. From time to time, people are killed. We don't follow it very closely. And that's it.
But the world has lived with this problem for 100 years now.
Exactly. But we.
No, with Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah, I agree with you. But we cannot afford it to live with it. Neither the Palestinians, who deserve their self-determination and their rights, and they will get it only in their own state. If they are waiting for their rights to be given to them in a context of a one-state solution, when Israel is the dominant part, they are not realistic. This is a dream which will never come true. If there is a realistic one, and even that is very difficult to achieve, is that to have their rights in their own country. And this is why, I mean, if we are referring to the difficulties of the political level, I can tell you one example. You know, when in 2003, a group of Palestinians and a group of Israelis signed an agreement which is called the Geneva Initiative. And Arik Sharon was the prime minister of Israel. He was actually the father of the settlements. And an extreme rightist And he called us all traitors. Some of us were people from the former defense establishment, and some of them were members of parliament from different parties, but we were all traitors for him because we wanted to make peace with the Palestinians. And eventually, he did not succeed in convincing the people that we were all traitors, and it became a popular plan, relatively. More than, I mean, there were 39% of the Israelis were supportive of it. And few days after the Geneva Initiative was signed, Sharon declared that he would withdraw from Gaza unilaterally, although beforehand he had said that he would never give up on the Gaza Strip, because for him, Gaza was like Tel Aviv. He came to the United States, April 2004, and interviewed by the New York Times on April 16, 2004. And he was asked, how come that after saying so often that you will never give up on any settlement in the Gaza Strip, you are giving up on the whole strip? And he said, it is because I was worried that a plan like this so bad plan, which is called the Geneva Initiative, in which Israel is giving away so much of its land, will be adopted by Israelis, and I felt that I had to suggest a counter plan. So when we are speaking about leaderships and about the impact of something like that, if our modest plan is going to trigger something, if Israeli leaders and Palestinian leaders will say, okay, confederation is very bad, but we have something else, I mean, we will not prevent them from doing it, because we feel that the current situation is awful. Every day people are killed. Many Palestinians, fewer Israelis. Israel is losing the dream of a Jewish, democratic, liberal state. Palestinians are giving up on their dream for having their own state. You know, when I'm talking to young Palestinians, it happens to me quite a lot. You know what they are telling me? I mean, they say, you are selling us the old dream of a state. We prefer to be part of Israel, as is. As is. Although we know that you will not give us the right to vote for the Knesset. So be it. What are we going to have? The right to vote in a dictatorship? Where the parliament doesn't play any role? So we prefer to be Israelis. You think that our dream for the future is to have the majority and then to use the democratic tools and to demand an equal vote? Maybe, maybe not. In the meantime, allow us to be Israelis. And I cannot accept it. I cannot accept it. So the question is, if I cannot accept it, what do I suggest? The only solution is the two-state solution. To make it easier to get there, we are suggesting something. If this is a dream, Lara, you may be right. Suggest something else. Don't leave us in the same situation.
Thank you. We'll come to the something else in a minute. But before we go there, Omar, in an article you wrote about the Confederation called Stuck Together, you say that there are many ways of looking at this conflict as a national national determination, self-determination for Israelis, for Palestinians, and so on, but also as settler colonial, right? This confederation seems to answer the desire by both nations to have a national home, the self-determination dream, but it doesn't seem to address the settler colonial part. And if a growing number of Palestinians and their supporters worldwide, especially in the United States, move to view this conflict as a conflict between settler colonial project and kind of native population, then this solution doesn't address it. And the fear is that the Palestinians, or a majority or sufficient number of Palestinians, would view this just as a transition, again, to kind of flood Israel in, Palestinian refugees, quote unquote, coming back. And that this will be a step on the way, and the conflict will not end until the Jewish character of Israel as a home for the Jews, is dismantled. What do you say to this?
So I think the starting point is, and this in a sense is a response to the question that you posed to Yossi as well. The starting point is, what can
That you have your own answers to your own questions.
I figure
regardless of what.
I'm going to answer Yossi's instead of mine. He's did a much better job than I would. But my own personal motivations in getting involved in this were in part to try to find a solution that I not only could tolerate, which is how I felt about the two-state solution as it was conceived during the time I was working in the negotiations, but one that I could embrace, that I could champion, that felt right, even if it didn't feel feasible in the immediate term. And feasibility for me is a problem, but it's not a reason not to do this intellectual work. And so, to me, there is a critical need to say there is a solution that can address not every piece of this puzzle, but can address a range of things that are critically important to people in both societies, if only as a means of addressing, of creating hope, of avoiding total descent into nihilism. Now, part of the reason I believe this solution is as good as it is because I think it is responsive to each of the frames. And if you take the settler colonial frame, bear in mind that what is conceived of here is three things that I think are critical. Number one, that there is actually a path toward Palestinian refugees reclaiming their place in the places that are critically important to them. Now, it's done in a way that is designed not to prevent there from remaining a space in which Jews are a political majority, and that's why you've got this complicated setup with these Palestinians returning to Israel but being permanent residents rather than being citizens, and were there not a reciprocal frame with respect to the settlers, and even with that reciprocal frame, I can see why there's some concern. But one has to be in the business of identifying something that addresses all of the different problems to some extent. And this provides an opportunity for that problem to be resolved amicably. I think, secondly, the settlers, after all, come under Palestinian sovereignty, the point that you were raising the security implications of it earlier, which I'll come back to. And so this means that what we have is not a continuation of settlements in in the state of Palestine, but a Jewish community in Palestine, a Jewish community which will, in terms of its organization, not exclude Palestinian neighbors. And that, to me, is an utter transformation of the frame in which we currently exist. It's a movement toward a different kind of integration. And I think more broadly, this is what Confederation allows us to do is to think about how we sort of achieve what seems at first glance to be impossible. Self-determination for both peoples and treating this space, which has been scarred by boundaries imposed upon us as a result of colonialism, treat this space as having an integrity of its own, as Palestine-Israel, Israel-Palestine, and a space through which people can move freely. And that, to my mind, is the opposite of not only the regime that we've got in place, but the regime that is so heavily criticized. So I understand the concerns. There is literally no solution that is responsive to every single criticism that can be posited, but this is one that we can dream about, and there's a value to dreaming.
All right, thank you. Lara, you suggested, if I heard you correctly, but also in other talks, that a right-based approach seems to be more plausible. And my question then, I want to reverse the question I asked them to you. How is this even more realistic?
So I guess I would actually just pick up where Yossi left off, because I don't believe I said that I think this solution is a dream. I said I think it's utterly disconnected from the reality that exists on the ground today and where both peoples are. And that's, it's good to dream and it's good to theorize and all of that. I mean, the idea, if you listen to Palestinians, and I think, Yossi, you and I talk to different Palestinians, and I would encourage people to listen to as many voices as you can. I've not met with any Palestinian youth in the West Bank, and I haven't been allowed to go to Gaza for a while, who want to become Israeli. But the bottom line is, when I talk to my Palestinian friends and colleagues, the rights-based approach is not the idea that it is attached to a solution. It is a solution for many people. It is solution agnostic. If the idea is that Palestinians will perpetually have their basic human and civil rights on hold until there is a solution and that solution is implemented, then I would argue that that framing is indefensible today. It might have been defensible in the era of Oslo, when I think there was a brief window, and Oslo, people should remember, was intended to move quickly from the actual plan and agreement to its implementation. I would argue in 2022 that putting forth the idea that Palestinians have to perpetually have their rights on hold until we can get consensus around a plan and then that plan is implemented, and it is a dream or somehow irrational to pursue rights outside of that, I think that's a problem. And I don't think you're going to find a lot of Palestinians who will buy onto that anymore. And I would say, for people who want to, say, well, you need a plan. I understand that what I'm saying is not particularly comforting for people who want to see a plan that wraps this all up. I wrote an op-ed years ago, which I never published, which was entitled, "Stop talking about the problems on the ground, we're making peace." Stop talking about settlements, stop talking about settler violence, stop talking about land confiscation, we're making peace. Because once we make peace, all of that will be resolved. I don't think that works anymore. And if you can't be solution agnostic, then I think you need to look at what your own values are. Because if the idea is that Palestinian rights cannot be pursued if it ends in a solution that you're not comfortable with, are they really rights? Do you really think that human beings have a right to security in their own home, property rights, a right to not be arbitrarily arrested and detained, a right not to be exiled from their home or held indefinitely in administrative detention? If you think that those rights are only rights after there's a peace process and that peace process gets to a solution that you're comfortable with, then I would urge you to reconsider whether you think they're actually rights, or whether maybe you don't think Palestinians have rights, and maybe you see these as privileges that are contingent upon a solution that you're comfortable with. I have reached the point intellectually, and I find that as I get older and do this longer, I have to lean into my own discomfort. It is uncomfortable to be solution agnostic. I think it is difficult morally, given what's happening today, given what's happened over the past 20 years, to justify anything else in terms of what we do today. You can dream about solutions, You can actually do incredible work laying out a framework of what a solution could be if there were the goodwill and the political will to do it. But we've had decades now where all the political will is taking us in a different direction.
Okay, I just want you to apply the same standard that you apply to the solution, to the two-state or the confederal solution, to the right-based approach. It's not that the Palestinians don't have rights. It's not that using excuses to postpone the rights is wrong. it is politically, the idea that they will get equal rights politically is as unfeasible as the two-state solution, even if it's morally more compelling. But politically, there is no path to equal rights. That's the problem. And, sorry to kind of push it, it feels better to kind of stick to equal rights, but it's equally unrealistic. That's my contention.
So what I think one problem here is we're using rights to mean different things, and political rights versus civil rights and human rights, they're all intertwined. But in the instant that we're talking right now, it's the first. It's human rights, it's civil rights, it's the right to freedom of movement, it's right to be safe in your own home. It's all of the basic rights that Palestinians are deprived of in the West Bank. Much of Gaza faces a different, in many ways, much, much worse situation. So that's it. Focusing on rights is not a solution, and I insist on that. Nobody is suggesting that that is the solution. The idea is that is what you deal with now. And honestly, I will say one of my frustrations when I talk to my friends about two states or confederation, fine, if you believe in that, you're gonna have to walk and chew gum if you want it to be credible. If you are someone who adamantly thinks confederation is the right way, if you are not also right now simultaneously changing the reality on the ground. Again, last week, Israel implemented these new regulations in the West Bank. It has gotten almost no coverage in the US. The US administration has said they're concerned. They're concerned. I mean, this is where we are today. No, Palestinians right now don't have rights. And that is not, it is untenable to think that you are going to come up with a solution that's going to give people hope when their reality is this. It's sort of like when people complain that Palestinian textbooks teach Palestinian kids to hate Israelis. The occupation teaches Palestinian kids to hate Israelis. They don't need textbooks. The reality teaches Palestinians to be skeptical of plans. They don't need people like me to criticize the plan. And there's plenty of critiques. I mean, you guys have both raised them, I think, with great intellectual candor. There's plenty of critiques.
All right, thank you very much. I see Bernie's want to talk, and for the sake
I'm
of
just
peace
going to
in the
make,
course.
I just want to make a sort of slightly, I hope it
Brief.
won't be thought a pedantic point, which is there is no conception of rights that does not have a corresponding commonwealth to protect and enforce rights. One doesn't have to go back to Thomas Hobbes to say that. And we are talking here about what kind of just commonwealth might be possible, what kind of regime of protection and institutional life will make it possible for rights to be enforced. Unfortunately, we live in a country whose constitution says that we're all endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights. Well, then go talk to the Creator. I mean, that's not where you get rights enforced. And talking vaguely about the rights of Palestinians without talking about some legitimate, just, defensible dream of how that commonwealth will look seems to me fatuous. I must say something else. No one on this panel has not been on the ground. No one. I've been out, with settlers. I've been out with trying to pick olives with Arabs who are attacked by settlers. I know something about settlers. I look out my window and I see them. The problem is that we have to be more concrete about how to enforce the rights that you're talking about.
All right, thank you. I think it's time to take the conversation to the audience and your questions. And Judith. Shall we get maybe a couple of questions and then respond? Okay.
My question is this. What successful precedents have there been for the kind of confederation that you're suggesting? You mentioned the European Union, but that's on a much, much larger scale. Similarly, well, the United States, I suppose, can be looked at as a confederation of 50 different states, but they're not all that different. Have there been some examples of the kind of thing that you're talking about? Switzerland, perhaps? I don't know.
Thank you.
Did you want to collect some questions first?
Maybe take this one. Very kind of weak.
Okay, sure. I'll offer a first answer. To be sure, the European Union is an important reference point, but it's not the only one. There's not a long and august history of confederations, in part because confederations tend to become something else. So either they merge and they become more integrated, like the United States did. We started as a confederation and became a federation, or because they split up. So, for example, in Serbia and Montenegro were a state union with confederal features. So there is not a super long track record of confederations being used for this purpose of resolving ethnic/identity conflict between peoples, but there is a fairly long history of confederation. Now, what I will say is that there's a much longer history of federations being used for this purpose. And we see that all over the world, whether we're talking about India, or we're talking about Spain, or we're talking about Belgium, which came up earlier. We see some of the same kinds of principles that we're trying to apply today, how you try to resolve the tension between giving folks self-determination and including a measure of unity and territorial integrity. And I think that our push toward confederation is that we think in the Israeli-Palestinian context, a federation requires a little more integration than we think is necessary or would be regarded as valuable by folks. And so confederation provides a better answer on that front. Yossi, did you want to add anything to that?
I just had a quick question. We were talking about facts on the ground. In the Gaza Strip, you obviously have Hamas in power. If you were to hold elections in the West Bank, Fatah would lose in a landslide. And the Israelis, over time, have consistently given up land for peace, whether it be in Gaza or whether it be in Gaza with Sharon, and even in the early 2000s, you have Arafat being offered the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and the Palestinians still walked away from the negotiating table. So my question is this: one, do the Israelis have a real negotiating partner in a state with an illegitimate government right now, and if even would Hamas negotiate with the Israelis? And two, what would the Israelis be able to give up where the Palestinians would say, okay, we accept this?
Well, they agreed to the Arab Initiative in 2002, and they are still agreeing to it. So if you're asking me what can be accepted by them, this is very clear. Israel has a partner, and this partner is shaved, wearing suits, ties, and speaks English, and is very much against using violence. And to portray this partner as a terrorist is very easy. You just say, this person is a terrorist. So what? He is the one who is fighting against terrorism. And when he became the president on the Palestinian side, he ended the second intifada. It was him. So, yes, he is old, he is weak, he lost the Gaza, but he is a partner. And I'm sorry to say about Israel itself, I'm not sure that we are the partners for the Palestinians. Until very recently, you had a prime minister who replaced Bibi Netanyahu and said, I would not meet with Abu Mazen, I will never agree to a two-state solution. And Netanyahu paid a lip service to the idea of a two-state solution. It was of kind of importance, but a very limited one, because he did whatever he could in order to prevent it. So you can say that there is no, I mean, Lapid is something else. Lapid did support the idea of a Palestinian state. He does support it. And if he remains a prime minister, I hope that the situation will change. But I think right now, to say that Israel is the one which doesn't have a partner, regretfully, is wrong. And I think that what is important is not to give up for us on the solution and of the need to talk to the other side. Not talking to the other side is not a solution. And I really hope that it will change. And I don't dismiss the difficulties for us on the Palestinian side. I mean, the fact that there is such a split between Gaza and the West Bank is a big problem, not only for the Palestinians, but also for us, because you need an address. And the question is, how can you resolve the issue with Hamas if they are against a solution? So if you ask me that question, I will answer.
Thank you for coming today. My question is just sort of about the economic arrangement of the Confederation. So you mentioned, or the theoretical Confederation, you mentioned that the settlers, for example, in the West Bank, would have resident status in the Palestinian side of the Confederation. I assume that there's a pretty substantial economy there of hundreds of thousands of people and stores and businesses. Would they be paying taxes into like the Palestinian side of the Confederation, or like how would the economic divide work between the two?
Well, look, first of all, most of the settlers are within driving distance of the Green Line. And I would say that the settlements, for the most part, are dependent on people who are going back and forth over the Green Line and earning their livings in Israel proper. Yes, if they start businesses in Palestine, they should be paying taxes to the Palestinian state. But you see, again, we're missing the scale here. This is not Ukraine and Russia. If you live in Ma'ale Adumim, which is a pretty significant settlement to the east of Jerusalem, and if you want to vote in Jewish Jerusalem, your drive from Ma'ale Adumim to Jerusalem is 7 minutes. Okay? So when you understand the scale a little better and think about the economic life of the settlements, it's like a hub coming from Jerusalem. Those settlers often live and work, live in the settlements and work in Israel. And you can see the possibility of Palestinian businesses finding in Israel the suppliers and the advisors. I mean, I have a friend who started a supermarket in Ramallah, Sam Bahur. He started the first supermarket in Ramallah. He had a choice. I want to get a point of sale system. I have a choice. I can either go to Tel Aviv and take Ritalix, which is a 40-minute drive, or I can go to Texas and take NCR. What do you think he did? There are lots of Palestinians who've been over 100 young Palestinians are part of something called the Palestine Internship Program, which is started by a venture capital firm in Tel Aviv that brings Palestinian youth, young people, graduates of computer science departments and so on in Ramallah, and brings them into Israel to work at the global companies like Intel and others. And they go back to the West Bank. So I think it's important to understand we're talking about two hubs. We're not talking about two forts. We're talking about two hubs.
Also, thank you so much for coming. My question is, I guess, somewhat disjointed and a little two-parted. But Professor Fischer mentioned this earlier, that we've been living with this conflict for 100 years. Like, what's stopping us from living with it for more? And I guess my question regards two parts of that. And the first is, what's the Israeli incentive for doing this, in a non-hopeful sense, but in a more real sense, when the Arab world itself seems to be starting to move on publicly, and when they'd already been moving on privately for much longer? And, in that sense, like, what is the, we can talk about alternatives, you can talk about human rights, you can talk about all that stuff, but if Israel to some extent is content, and we already passed the point in which they had the best shot at a two-state solution in maybe like the mid-2000s or in the 1990s, why go back to it when a little violence here, a little violence there has been the standard, the status quo for the Israelis at this point for over 40 years?
The original idea of Zionism was to rescue Jews who were threatened in Russia and East Europe, in other places, by very cruel anti-Semitism, and to bring them to the land of Israel, which is the historical land of their forefathers, in order to have a state of their own in which they are a majority. The idea of majority, the Jewish majority, for any Jewish state in the future was agreed upon by all the political parties, right and left. It was obvious that there won't be a Jewish state without democracy and without a majority. Now, this was 120 years ago, and all these years, it has not changed. Now, if we remain where we are today, in the West Bank, and still in charge of Gaza indirectly, there won't be a Jewish majority. And most of the Israelis, most of them, are very worried about this issue of demography. Now, there are different solutions. I mean, one solution is to give the Arabs only partial rights or whatever. Those who see themselves as people who believe in peace and in liberalism will not accept it. And there is a big enough group in Israel which will not accept such a situation. So for this group, there are two main solutions. One is to have a kind of a separation and having two-state solutions in which the Palestinians will have their rights, will not be deprived of their rights, and the Israelis will have the Jewish majority. Another solution is unilateralism, like what Sharon did in Gaza, to do it in the West Bank. He himself planned to do it in the West Bank at a certain moment. We don't have a third solution. So if you ask me about the Israeli interest, it's not the interest of every Israeli. But the big majority is against the status quo, against a one-state solution, and for a two-state solution because of that. So we have this demographic need to assure that it is not a situation of a Jewish minority dominating a Palestinian majority. There are Israelis who don't care about it and say, okay, what are the rights that the Arabs have in their own Arab states? They have democracy, they have rights there. So they will live as a majority under the Jewish minority. And this is something which is intolerable for most of us. So this is the main interest. Besides the other issues of the Palestinian suffering and the need for them to have rights exactly as we have, and so on and so forth. It is a very, I would say, selfish interest of Israel to assure a majority and to have a line between us and the Palestinians. The Confederation is making this line much more, I would say, comfortable for the two parties.
I think Lara would like to add on the incentive.
Yeah, I just want to add, I'm not Israeli, and my view on this may be somewhat leaning in one direction, because I read everything the Israeli right writes. I sign up, I'm on multiple settler listservs, I'm on the equivalent of Breitbart for Israel. I read everything. And I don't think it's, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the Palestinian issue is not something that the Israeli public is seized with, really anywhere on the political spectrum. And I think that you just have to grasp that. It's not, and that's not, look, Americans aren't particularly seized with, I don't know, during the Trump era, how many of us went to the border to challenge kids in cages, right? How many of us went? I mean, this is, people are living their lives. It doesn't affect their daily lives. And then you get to this question of, well, what in the past has been the logic of why Israel would make these concessions or compromises or whatever? And there's always two sides to it. One is that you will gain great benefits, and if you don't do it, you risk bad things. And I think the problem is after 20-some years of peacemaking, Israelis have concluded rationally that they can reap all of those benefits without doing anything on this, and that the vaunted risks that they were running are not real. Whether you're talking about the security risks, they can handle it. Whether you're talking about the international community treating them as a pariah. In the United States, we're now going to see a case go to the Supreme Court, which is going to test whether or not Americans have the right to political protest in the form of boycotts. We are seeing the United States going to a point where we are going to outlaw effectively certain, not outlaw, we are going to limit the use of political boycotts in order to insulate Israel from economic pressure. I mean, it's not just that Israel isn't being treated as a pariah. We're actually seeing the powers of the world engage to make sure that Israel cannot be treated as a pariah. We're seeing the definition of anti-Semitism, which through this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, literally weaponized to make sure that criticism of Israel that is too uncomfortable is treated as illegitimate and anti-Semitism. So I think that if, again, going back to the Confederation idea, which is a really fascinating and exciting idea, but I think we have to be realistic about where the politics are today. The Oslo Accord was grounded in goodwill and a mutually shared commitment to making it happen. And it was mutual. I was there. I was on the ground, and for Oslo, it was an extraordinary feeling. I don't know how you build that back, but we're having elections imminently in Israel. Bibi believes in no solutionism. He's talked about this and written about this. He thinks the way forward for Israel is to stop even pretending there's a solution. He calls it no solutionism. He likely, if he goes back in government, will be partnered with open Kahanists who embrace an overt idea of Jewish racial superiority, racial, ethnic, religious superiority that is openly racist and discriminatory, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian. That's where that is. And the people who aren't voting for them aren't not voting for them because they care about the Palestinians. They're not voting for them because they care about, economics, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, all those things inside Israel. The Palestinians don't even figure into it. So I think we just have to be very realistic about this idea of incentives. What can Israel gain? I don't think most Israelis think they have anything to gain, and I don't think they think they have anything to lose by not going there.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about ethno-nationalism. I think we were just on. Is it on now? All right, thank you. I just want to talk a little bit about ethno-nationalism. I think we were just talking about that because Israel does define itself as a Jewish state, and it defines itself as a democracy as long as Jews are the majority, which seems a little odd to me that you can be a democracy as long as you control your own population. So I'm just kind of curious about how you think that kind of view internationally and domestically of ethno-nationalism being valid can be dismantled, and how perhaps we could kind of move towards a more authentic understanding of democracy among Israelis, that, it shouldn't be predicated on your race, the existence of a state. So how could we move away from that?
So thanks for a really interesting question. I think that one of the difficult conversations that is unfolding right now is about how to think about how to define what Zionism is. And you hear a lot of different people sort of saying, I'm a Zionist, or saying that they're anti-Zionist, without a lot of clarity about what the definition of Zionism is in these circumstances. And the thing is that people have a range of different ideas of what it is and should be. And I think that there is a version of it, to Lara's point, which involves Jewish supremacy within a particular space, that requires critique and advocacy against, where we can say, hey, in no territorial space is supremacy based on religion or ethnic identity appropriate, and where we can say, this reminds us of place X, Y, and Z where these kinds of issues are equally problematic. On the flip side, I think that there are those who identify as Zionists who say, what drives my Zionism is the belief in a space of refuge, or who believe that what is critical is that there is a space within which Hebrew language and culture is allowed to flourish, regardless of whether there is Jewish supremacy or even necessarily Jewish sovereignty. And I think that engaging what is driving people's concerns, what animates their desire for a Jewish state, in quotation marks, can be valuable because it provides opportunities to say, okay, what kind of institutional design can we create that allows for the things that you say that you need, refuge, and a safe cultural space, without being based on or perpetuating discrimination. And that, I think, opens up an array of policy answers. I think, all of that said, that one of the difficult things about the moment we're living is that it's a harder time to have those kinds of conversations rather than an easier time, as we were discussing a little bit earlier on. I think one way to get around that is to be really clear about the kind of thing, the kind of concept that is beyond the pale, and the kinds of concepts that can be reassuring to folks that we're prepared to countenance from a human rights perspective.
We should be very careful not to go back to the original debate between Jews and Palestinians about the basic rights for self-determination. Actually, the world decided from San Remo to 47 in the UN to have a two-state solution. It decided upon a Jewish state. It decided upon an Arab state, which is actually the Palestinian state. We can argue forever about the right of the Jewish people to have its own state. On both sides, we knew how to tell the other side that it doesn't exist. And no side was convinced by that. Israelis for years said there is no Palestinian people, it is an invention. The Palestinians said that there is no Jewish people, there is a religion. How come that you are speaking about a nation? What kind of a nation are you? There is a fact in the world, or there are facts in the world. You have a Palestinian people, you have a Jewish people. They both deserve their self-determination. And I believe that what we should work on is to ask ourselves, how do these two peoples live in peace. They went a long way, a long way. The Palestinians believed in one democratic state in which both peoples will live under them, and the Jews believed in the 20s, 100 years ago, that the solution is a one state, which includes part of Jordan of today, and Jews will be the dominant part of that, and the Arabs will be delighted by having them there because they will bring that technology and other things. Well, there were dreams, but they came to the conclusion in the last 30 years, more than 30 years, that they have to live side by side as two peoples with two states. And in my view, the main question is how can it be implemented? And about democracy, The Economist is publishing every year its survey about democracies in the world. If you look at this, the last one, about 21, Israel is a flawed democracy because of the rule in the territories. But you know what is the number of Israel in about 180 countries that they survey? Our number is 23. You know the number of the United States? 26. So, to come to Israel and say, what is a democracy? There you have a Supreme Court, you have parliament, you have... Okay, you don't have a democracy. There is a democracy. It is flawed. But it is not, it's not realistic to say about Israel that it is not a democracy, that it is fake, or whatever. It can be and should be criticized. Should be criticized. Because it is a democracy, it cannot go on and occupy the territories just by saying, actually, we had to defend ourselves. Yes, we had to defend ourselves. Yes, we did not initiate the tension which was conducive to the 67 war. I fought in the 67 war, and I remember the fears of another Holocaust that we had. We prepared cemeteries in 67, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, because we thought that Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was serious in saying that he is going to extinguish Israel. So it is true, but you cannot keep these territories forever. You are not benefiting from occupying it, and the occupied people is suffering every day, and you don't want to create this suffering. There are many, many, many Israelis who don't want their kids and their grandchildren to be the policemen of the West Bank. And I think that, again, when we go to the question of Israel is not benefiting from the West Bank. It is not that it is a delight to be there. For many parents, the notion that their children have to serve in the West Bank, in those settlements, is a nightmare. A nightmare. And now I'm speaking about grandchildren. So I think that it is an Israeli interest of a relative majority, of a plurality, but maybe a majority, to leave these territories in a way which will not endanger Israel itself. This is the point. But if you are raising again the question of how come that Israel is a ethno-democracy, leave it. Israel will never give up on its nature, and it shouldn't give up on its nature. And such talks are hollow. We should work together on the rights of the Palestinians, on their independence, and not on the original idea of whether or not it is right to have a Jewish state. This is a question for another century.
I just wanted to add one thing. I think that it is possible to conceive of a state that honors Jewish tradition, that provides refuge for Jews, but that doesn't define itself in the way that Israel is now. But while I agree with you about so much, Yossi, I can't agree that a state where millions of people have been denied the right to vote for decades now and who won't participate in choosing the prime minister whose fate they will, who will decide their fate in the years ahead, is a democracy, or even a flawed democracy. It's a partial democracy, I'd say. Yeah, yeah.
I was surprised, by the way. I agree with you.
All right.
Look at the economists.
Yes, I think for the sake of time, we need to collect the remaining questions and then get one response to it. So.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your discussion very much. My question is as follows. In terms of the realistic nature of this plan and recognizing that cities like Haifa, and Akko are very mixed, and Nazareth and Yaffo, like you mentioned, are heavily populated by Palestinians, I was curious if you could talk more about where you would envision actually drawing the borders of your proposed plan and how you would avoid creating a geographic situation that, to my understanding, is just as fragmented as the West Bank currently is now.
Thank you. More? There was another question on this side.
Thank you. More of a short comment than a question, and this goes to something that Bernie responded to Lara, and then back to Yossi and Omar. I think, Bernie, I agree with you totally. Rights depend on a political structure. They don't exist in the abstract. The problem is there is a political structure. It's called the State of Israel. And that state has decided to deny the rights of those people. And that's the problem. And I don't care if it's one state, two states, confederation. I think on some fundamental level, and it goes back to something Yossi said, I think the problem is Zionism. Why should that continue? It existed, as you said, refuge, majoritarianism, that all already exists. Ideologies don't have to be permanently bound and fused to the realities that they create. We had an ideology of manifest destiny in the 1870s, and we abandoned it, except some people. Which is interesting, right? So why Zionism? Why not think of some other ideological way of creating coexistence? Because the Zionism is really, in a certain sense, undergirding everything Lara said. That's what it is. It's a Zionist state, and the Zionism itself, from its inception, Yossi, was chauvinistic, for good reason in its time. But the question is, has that time passed?
There is a question. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. I'll keep it short and simple. So the fundamental, in my view, tenet of confederalism is that both groups must recognize the other one's existence because you're living next to each other. That's how confederation works. And my question is, short and sweet, how can we change the right wing in Israel and then I guess Hamas in Gaza and I guess the growing support for Hamas in the West Bank to essentially get this view that the other one has a legitimate right to live next to one another? Because if we don't establish this view, the Confederation plan is unfortunately just a dream. So that's my question. Thank you.
All right, so this is a question specifically for Lara, but you recently tweeted a link to an article that proposed that violence is even more tragic to allow it only to an oppressor while forbidding it to the oppressed, which is obviously not easy to refute. But when talking about violent resistance in the case of Palestinians, a demographic of people with far less resources than the IDF, there is a rhetoric that exists that this violence has only justified further Israeli oppression and IDF violence. So firstly, how valid do you think that this claim is? And secondly, could you talk about how the rise of new and potentially more successful resistance groups could further erase the existence of Palestine and rather than liberate Palestinians?
Thank you. So I will kind of exercise my moderator powers and assign the questions to speakers. So we start with Lara on this.
Yes. All right, I'm going to answer you, and I'm also going to, one more point I wanted to bring up, so I have the microphone. No, I appreciate that. And for folks who don't follow me on Twitter, this is an article written, it was published today. It was written by Mitchell Plitnick, and it's looking at this question of resistance, which is very much, it hasn't come up today at all. And I think it's relevant because we've talked about, well, Palestinians support the two-state solution. They still believe in the peace process. I would encourage people to look at what's happening on the ground, where you have a generation, and multiple generations, but now you've got essentially a younger generation of young men, particularly now in Jenin and Nablus, which are two of the most squeezed large population areas. They're surrounded by settlements. The IDF enters them regularly. And you essentially have young groups that are saying, we're done. And we are rejecting our parents' generation, which said our rights will only be achieved through nonviolence. We are reasserting our right to resist using violence, and that is painful for all of us who've worked on this for years. It is incredibly painful. What it is starting, though, is a really important debate, and I'm not going to offer you answers. I retweeted that article, so I thought it was really important to think about. But, I've had Palestinian friends of mine for the past, however many months sending me articles about Ukraine. They say, look, when Ukrainians, use force to try to defend themselves against Russians coming into their towns and doing this, they're celebrated by the international community, which is sending them recipes for explosives. And when the IDF comes into our villages and attacks us and we throw rocks, we're called terrorists. Or if our cousins come and this time they've got guns trying to get the IDF to leave, they are shot and called terrorists who are attacking, where IDF soldiers are treated as civilians. And I think this is a really important discourse to have because they're, again, going to the question of rights. Do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against the IDF? Let's go back a while ago to the visuals of Ahlan Tamimi, a young woman who was jailed for pushing an IDF soldier, right? She pushed him, that was using force, and she was jailed for it. Go back if you don't remember that case, it's fascinating. The idea that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all Israelis, including armed and armored IDF soldiers and armed civilians, are exactly the same civilians as someone in Tel Aviv, so that a Palestinian in their own village using armed resistance against a soldier is exactly the same as a Palestinian bomber traveling to the middle of Tel Aviv and blowing themselves up. That is going to be increasingly challenged. It is being challenged now. And I think it really is intellectually and morally something we all have to grapple with. All of you here have to grapple with, all of us. Because we have had, I think, the luxury, the unearned luxury for however many decades now to pocket the Palestinians' commitment to not use force, while they are facing organized violence against them by a military that holds all the cards and all the legitimacy. So I think it's deeply problematic. I want to make one very short other point, just this is the last time I'm going to talk. No, I'm answering you. The other point is, one thing that's come up here, we've talked about a confederation and confederation being a solution and equality. And I think this is maybe more for the students this age that's thinking about this. What is always absent from these conversations is the word equity. And your generation is the generation that taught me to think about this. It's something that people of my generation, I'm Gen X, didn't think about, and Black Lives Matters really caught us by surprise. The idea that this is not finished business because we have equality, but we don't have equity. And if you talk to Palestinians in the West Bank and you propose, hey, listen, we can come to a deal where your lives will get immediately better based on freezing the status quo as it is on the ground, you'll be able to travel more easily, but that settlement up on the hill where all of the arable land of your village was taken and your grandfather's land was taken and a settlement was built on it, that wealth that's been transferred to Israelis, that's never coming back. We're going equality from here forward. We see how that looks in the United States decades later, when you have systemic inequalities that exist when you start with a status quo that is inequitable, and then you make your peace from there.
Thank you. And is it time for Zionism to move on?
Well, Shaul wrote a book on Kahanism and Kahana, and I suspect that he's using the word Zionist in a way that Kahana would have been rather pleased with. Look, I completely agree with you that if what you mean by Zionism is some form of supremacy, or to put it even differently, some form of institutional arrangement where people who are legally defined as Jews have privileges that people who are not legally defined as Jews don't have, I completely agree with you. I wrote 2 books on it. In 1985, I wrote The Tragedy of Zionism precisely on this question, because Zionism created this scaffolding for a state, and the scaffolding was never taken down, and that was a problem. It's been a fetter on Israeli democracy since 1949. I agree with you. I don't look at Zionism that way. I think of Zionism as a movement to advance a cultural revolution among Jews so that a modern Hebrew-speaking society would allow us to survive modernity. Now, if someone believes that Jews who are Orthodox and so on can survive modernity without Zionism, tfaddal. But that's not my view. Okay. I want to make one last point that Laura, now I have the mic. I want to make one last point about the fact, about the proposition that I want to make one last point about the proposition that we have nothing to gain and nothing to lose in Israel. The fact that we have a great deal to gain, I've already made the case, but the idea that we have nothing to lose with the status quo, I just want to remind you of May of 2021. May 2021. There were rockets falling on Tel Aviv. People were not sure if the rockets that are 20 times greater in South Lebanon wouldn't start falling on the rest of the country. We weren't sure. We saw that the Palestinian Israeli towns, the mixed towns that you spoke about a moment ago, were full of rioting. There was the possibility that that rioting would spill over into another intifada in the West Bank. There was the possibility that the Palestinian refugee camps in Amman would topple the Kingdom of Jordan and give Israel a border as hostile as Lebanon. We in Israel have a great deal to lose by moving toward peace. The idea that we can pretend that things can go on the way they are now and there'll never be a price for it is really absurd.
All right, thank you. Where would you draw the border and how you get Hamas to accept, Hamas and the likes, and then we end with Yossi about how to get the Israeli right to accept such an idea. And I'm sure you have other points that you want to raise.
I feel encouraged by that. So there are lots of different ideas about where a border of a confederation should be drawn. If you look at the A Land for All program, which is a grassroots movement, what they say is 1967 border. The Holy Land Confederation paper, which we worked on together, suggests you start with the 1967 border and make some adjustments comparable to those that were contemplated in Geneva and Taba, where you have some settlements being annexed by Israel in exchange for equal land exchange. But what we don't anticipate in either of these circumstances is, a scheme like the one described in relation to the 1947 partition plan, twin serpents entwined in an inimical embrace. Meaning a measure of territorial coherence would make the Confederation work better. The possibility for distortion, if others take this up, though, is of course great. And so it all, the devil is in the details at the end of the day. In terms of Hamas, I really think that we were talking about this a little bit earlier on. I think Hamas is likely to, its prevalence across Palestinian political life in the given moment, and recognizing that it goes up and down depending on both the fortunes of Hamas and situation in the Gaza Strip, and on the prospects for change in the West Bank. To the extent that there is actually a path toward something transformative that the Palestinian Authority leaders can point to, I think Hamas is in a more difficult position. I think that popular legitimacy will go with those who deliver results to Palestinians. And the Fatah has so far been unable to do it. To the extent that they are more able to do it, I think the question then becomes, how do you create a framework through which Hamas doesn't feel so excluded that they feel an incentive to act as spoilers? There are ways of doing that. There have been people in the Hamas leadership who have signaled their willingness to countenance and even embrace a long-term two-state framework, so long as that framework addresses precisely the kinds of issues that we're trying to address constructively. And so I think that they are no harder to bring along than some members of the coalition that until recently was governing Israel, and probably than some members of the coalition that will be bringing about, that we will see come to power on November 1st. That doesn't make it easy, but I don't think that they're an impossible actor to work with in Palestinian life.
Well, there is no question that there is a group of settlers which will fight against any solution of partition, including the Confederation one. And there is no question that Hamas will be against any peace solution between Israel and the Palestinians. The question is, how can we prevent them from being the spoilers of any attempt to have peace between the two peoples? One, we have to understand that they may use tools unexpected by us. This was the situation in the past. We did not expect something like the massacre in Hebron in 94, or the assassination of Rabbi. And it came from our ranks. We thought that the only threat is on the Palestinian side. And the threat came also from our side, and a very severe one. So we should be very careful about looking back and see whether people who are Israelis and are ready to pay any price in order to prevent peace will not be the ones who torpedo it. The Confederation idea by itself is dealing with this issue, because what is happening? The settlers are saying, we won already. You see, we are several hundred of thousands, not as we wanted to be more than 1 million, but it is a significant number which prevents you from having any solution, not unilateral, neither a Palestinian state, because what are you going to do with us? In brackets, the Trump solution with the 15 enclaves, I mean, which is totally crazy, but you see that you have to deal with us settlers and to see that there is no realistic solution as long as we are there. And what we are telling them in this, in the context of this Confederation solution, hey, we are not going to evacuate you. Next Thursday in the afternoon, we are leaving. Those of you who want to stay, fine. Those of you who want to leave will get compensation. Bye-bye. And suddenly, the victory of the settlers, that they actually won the day because they prevented us from saving ourselves, Israelis and Palestinians, is off. So I think that we can deal with the issue of the spoilers. I'm not saying that it is going to be easy. What I'm saying is that they should not be too happy already now.
I'm sure everybody has probably more questions than answers, and I think that makes this event very successful because this is what this is about, stimulating questions and exploring venues for answers. I just want to thank you for coming all the way to Dartmouth and having this event. I also want to thank the Lewin family and the Dickey Center, the director, but also Tom, Judith, and everybody who worked hard on making this happen. It took a long organization and work, and we're really, really grateful for that. And thank you all for coming.